Hello everyone. So a couple of days ago I posted a photo on my Instagram of this knife that cracked, and I showed the grain structure in there, and there's a little bit of confusion about what I was talking about. So I wanted to do a video on grain structure, what to look for, what's practical, etc, etc, etc. I'm going to apologize in advance. I've filmed this video over quite a few hours today because it's not all of the footage is making it into the final video, let's say that. It's a little bit ranty. It's not quite a rant video. It started out as one, but really I want this to be an education piece like I want most of my things to be with my channel. You guys that have been following me for a while understand this. So I've shot and reshot different aspects of this and tried to keep a nice broad view on things. So I apologize in advance if the footage is a bit jumpy around or I seem to drift. Watch the whole thing all the way to the end, and you'll get the final message in the right way. But yeah, it's been I've had to jump back a few times and jump forward again and film over here and film over there, and as different thoughts have hit me, or I've recorded something and thought, I'm not happy with the way I worded that. So yeah, bear with me for this video. It's going to be a little bit hoppy. So you may see, whether or not the camera's going to focus on this is a entirely different kettle of fish here, but you may see here that while very fine, the grain structure is still somewhat visible to the human eye. Now, in the post, I said that I was happy with what I saw, and I needed to do this video because it caused quite a bit of a stir. I needed to do a video to explain what I mean when I talk about that. And I thought it was a fantastic opportunity to explain grain structure to any newer bladesmiths that are joining in the craft and making knives on their own. So grain structure, I won't get into technical details. I'll leave that to people who are much more capable at doing that. But when you snap hardened steel, or any steel really, and by snap, I literally mean snap, not cut. If you cut steel, you won't see this. But if you snap it, you will see that the inside of the steel is made up of something that looks very different to what the outside of the steel looks like. It'll be very pale, and it will have a granularity to it. Now, the tightness and fineness of that granularity is a very good indicator of how hardened, how correctly hardened, and how far hardened the steel is. A nice, tight, fine grain structure is what you're looking for. Ideal grain structure you can't see with the human eye. You would need to get like a jeweler's loupe or a microscope to actually see the grain structure. To the human eye, it would look flat, matte, light gray, pale gray, or as close to that as is humanly possible. That is ideal grain structure. Now what that means is basically different steels have different temperatures that they want to reach to be critical, different amount of time that you want to hold it at critical, and different speeds at which you quench it in order to, and then different temperatures and lengths of time that you want to temper it back in order to achieve that ideal grain structure. Although the tempering doesn't really affect the grain structure, that's different steels have different requirements for how to achieve ideal hardness for that blade. Now, when you're working with scrap steel, the only real way you're going to do that if you don't know what the steel is, and I highly recommend checking out my Scrap First Known Steel video on this topic, but in order to get that ideal hardness for that steel, you really need to actually do some significant testing on the piece of steel to see what sort of grain structure you can achieve with it. And if you put it through its paces of heat treatment, quenching, tempering, does it hold up to the tasks that you want that thing to do? Because we're not just talking knives here. A lot of different applications require hardened steel. Chisels is a good one, draw knives, and even pry bars require a certain amount of hardening. the grain structure is the best way to actually see it. So when I posted a photo showing my grain structure, which I did put a contrast filter on so you can, it makes it look rougher than it actually is. It's really hard to capture on camera, but it's this photo here. When you look at it, you can see the grains, and in the post, I said I was happy with what I saw. And the reason that I said I was happy with what I saw is because a non-hardened, if a steel hasn't hardened up at all, or I've done my quench very badly, the grain structure will be quite large. It'll look something like this. It'll look like sand grains or sugar grains, or even raw sugar grains if you've done a really bad job. When you fully normalize steel, it should, and anneal it, the grains will be big like that, and when you harden it, it will constrict it down and get very, very small and fine. So the fact that my steel grain structure had gone down to a finer amount, it shows that I was heading in the right direction. And the fact that getting the crack and having the knife fail wasn't a total loss, because it shows that my backwater hardening process is working for me. So that brings up the main reason behind this video, because very few people, especially beginners, have access to heat treatment ovens, Paragon kilns and Kiln Frog kilns, and all this sort of really cool equipment that you can actually set a very specific temperature. It will get to that temperature and hold at that temperature for a certain amount of time. You can thermocycle, you can normalize with them. They're all computer controlled, wonderful pieces of machinery. Very few people actually have the means to be able to get that sort of thing. So a lot of indie knife makers, myself included, I'm still fairly new to this, despite the fact that people seem to think I'm not. I have a coal forge, a gas forge, and some Horton's Q, which is like a Parks 50 equivalent quenchant oil, but I also have rice bran oil, canola oil, sorry Niels, and various other quenchants that I use for various tasks. And depending on what I'm doing, sometimes that quench is just straight water. Now, it all depends on what I'm trying to achieve. Now, it's always going to be a crapshoot, really, and it requires testing, because I can't say this is the exact temperature that my knife was held at for this amount of time. I just don't have the means to do that. I have infrared thermometers that I can hold against the side of it, but by the very nature of a forge, as soon as I pull the blade blank out in order to test the temperature, it's dropped by sometimes as much as 50 or 60 degrees, which can throw off, I live in a very cold environment, which would throw off a quench. And I've put up footage of me quenching blades before. You can see how smooth and fast the action has to be in order to maintain that temperature. So to address the elephant in the room, we are going to talk about the practicality of grain structure, because there was a bit of a to-do on Instagram about my post, and I wanted to actually explain what I mean. Now, I like to think of grain structure and hardness of steel, or the performance of steel, in sort of like a linear graph. Now, down one side you have steel, or let's use knives as an example. Have knives that are unsuitable for task, which means they have not been hardened correctly. That's at the very far end, left side of the scale. At the far right side of the scale, there is the hardness that is the ideal hardness that steel is capable of reaching. That means it has been held to the correct temperature for the correct time. It has been quenched in the correct medium to quench it at the correct speed. It has been tempered beautifully at the right temperature for the right time. It's ideal, it's perfect for whatever steel that is, and that does require knowing what the steel is that you're working with. So if at one end we've got a knife that is not suitable, it has not been hardened, and at the other end we have a perfect knife, the range of what is practical and what is realistic actually sits somewhere in between. Basically you can divide it into 4 sections, which I am doing graphically above my head here. On the left-hand side, the first section is knives that are not suitable for task. Now, this actually is where a lot of knives bought on Amazon or eBay or imported from foreign countries that are known for, I won't name any, but are known for producing bad knives. And I say that they're improperly heat treated to a point where the knife does not function as the tool that it was intended. They will bend, notch, roll the edge, they won't hold an edge, you can never get them sharp. It's just, that's the first section. You don't want your knife to be in this section. The next section, across from that, is a knife that does perform the task, but does it badly. I'm talking about, little Oz 8 steels and the cheaper knife steels that you can buy a knife for, $50 or $60, and yeah, it'll do the job. It will cut. You can get an edge on it, but edge retention will be low. You'll have to be maintaining it a lot, sharpen it a lot. It has a tendency to want to lose the tip if you're doing aggressive tip work on it, things like that. But it does do the job. It just doesn't do it well. The third quarter of this chart is the knives that do the job perfectly well, and they stand up to the rigors of the test, despite not being ideally heat treated. They are heat treated to a point where they are very durable, though not ideal. This is the range that I consider myself to sit in. I'm not a master bladesmith, I'm not a journeyman smith, I'm not even an apprentice smith. I have been making knives now for about 9 months, and really what it comes down to for me is, do they pass the strict tests that I put them through? And I will be going into that, and once again I recommend checking out that video on known vs scrap steel, because Sam Towns actually has a beautiful segment in there where he shows the testing that a responsible knife maker does to their blades. And now the final segment of this chart is the knives that can perform beautifully, just exactly the same as the last segment did. However, they perform perfectly. And by perfectly, I mean that they have reached perfect heat treatment. The grain structure is so fine on them that they are just ridiculous performers. I genuinely applaud the people who want to actually stay in the far end, because it is an art form. It is, the first person to say it is an absolute art form. The metallurgy that goes in achieving that sort of thing, and the equipment that goes into it, and the expertise that goes into it, is absolutely an art form. However, if you're just looking to make knives that are going to be used and beaten up, and you want them to be out there in the field, the third section of this chart actually is fine to be in, so long as your testing methods are done well, done right, and that your knives pass them. So let's go into a little bit of what I mean with that. So my testing station involves various things. A wooden bat is, a nice heavy wooden bat is pretty essential. Some mild steel bar is fairly essential. And down here, chucked up in my vise, just off camera, is a piece of pine 2x4. Now, testing a knife before you send it out is not only responsible to do as a knife maker, but necessary. You are putting things out there that are designed to be used, unless you're making wall hangers, and then you can just switch off this video. But I'm talking about knives that are meant to be used. They're going to be put through situations where the person that is using them may actually be relying on them. And so you want to make sure that it will be up to task. So when I say that I'm happy with the grain structure of this broken blade, really what it comes down to is the fact that this broke is unfortunate. It's very true. However, it was a very good chance to see inside of a knife, because when you are going to be selling a knife, you don't break it first before selling it. You don't often get to see what's in there. You've got to rely on the fact that your heat treatment works well, and just sort of trust that nothing went awry. Very easy to do when you've got heat treatment kilns and things like that, but when you're doing it on the rough with gas forges or coal forges, and you're doing it at home in a backyard sort of setup, knowing that everything went fine is impossible until you test. Now, this blade here that snapped, actually, despite its visible yet very fine grain structure, still performs all of these tests. I can take the mild steel, chock it up in my vise, and bat on this blade into the mild steel, and the edge will stay together. I can draw knife it across the steel and pull shavings off of the mild steel with this blade, and the edge of the blade will stay together. I can jam the tip in and bend it and bend it and bend it, and I was getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the wood until it finally actually did snap on me when I had put it in about 6 mil into the wood. And this is a fairly fine tipped knife. You wouldn't always do that. Like a knife like this, which is actually made from the same steel, using the same heat treatment methods, has a much more obtuse tip angle and can withstand tip testing a bit better than something with a very fine, aggressive tip like that particular knife had. But I will tip test it anyway, and it will stand up to all of those tests regardless of the fact that it has a grain structure that, while very fine, is actually visible. So let's have a look. I'll show you. But this sort of aggressive testing is not the only thing that is going to matter, because a knife does also need a sharpened edge. And to test whether or not your temper has actually gone, or your heat treatment and temper has gone well enough, you need to do what's called the brass rod test, which is a test that shows that the edge of your knife is heat treated enough that it can actually bend without staying bent. So if you've got the apex of the knife, you want to be able to push over and then snap back into place. And you do this with the brass rod test. So let's put an edge on this knife and then subject it to that and see how it goes. So you can see the edge on this is intact. There's no dings that are catching my fingernail. It's together. It's held up. And that was being batoned into steel. That was being used to scrape off shavings of that steel. It was jammed into wood and bent back to lift up chunks of wood. And that's with a grain structure that you can see. Now, does that mean that I'm in the far end of my little spectrum here? Absolutely not. If you can see the grain structure, that steel could be hardened better. It really could. And you know, if you want to chase that, then that is an art form that is difficult to achieve without specialist equipment, but not impossible at all. And it's a worthy cause. However, being in the second to last category, where your knives perform all of the testing adequately and stand up to the trials that they will be, and exceed the trials that they will be going through as part of their use, daily use, is fine. And anybody that is seeking to make knives themselves should at least aim for this, at least. Having a larger grain structure is not necessarily, when I say larger, I mean large enough that you can just start seeing the individual grains, does not mean it's a underperforming or poorly made knife. What makes it an underperforming or poorly made knife is it not standing up to the trials that are required of it. And that's it, really. It's a matter of practicality. And anything that goes past that and tries, anyone that says if it doesn't have a tight enough grain structure, then it's not a proper knife, it's just elitism. And I do have a problem with elitism, because practicality trumps all. And I test my knives very, very hard, because I don't want them to fail in the field. And so if I had made it badly, if it was done poorly, it would not stand up to those tasks. The edge would roll, it would chip, it would dull very, very quickly, and I get nothing but good feedback on my knives. As much as it probably angers a lot of people to hear that sort of thing, it's the truth. When it comes down to it, a knife is a tool, and can it do the job is the only question that matters. Now, there's an old Chinese adage that basically translates to you're standing too close to the elephant. It means look at the bigger picture, and sometimes you get blinded because you're standing so close to the elephant that all you can see is his grey wrinkled skin. And you need to stand back to be able to see that what you're looking at is actually an elephant. And I find that this whole argument of grain structure is one of those situations, because ultimately a knife is a tool, and it comes down to how it's being used, how it's expected to be used, and then as a matter of responsible knife making, pushing it past what it is expected to be used by a certain extent. That is realistic, and seeing whether or not it can survive that before shipping it out to have it be used in that regard. So if you're focusing too much on attaining perfect grain structure, you're standing too close to the elephant, and you need to actually realize that or remember the fact that we're making tools here, and a tool is only as good as how well it works. Now, this, while a controversial topic, is not a dig at anybody. I mean, I have the greatest respect for the people who do try and attain perfection in their work. I focus my enjoyment, or get my enjoyment, elsewhere in the craft. I don't try to seek perfection. I try to seek, I love to see my stuff getting used. It's probably the thing that brings me the most joy, is giving out something that is beautiful and also functional, and then seeing it actually having that function be done repeatedly and adverse conditions even, and seeing my work hold up. And it does, and it has a reputation of holding up, especially locally. There's a lot of farmers and hunters that use my gear and get nothing but positive responses under some pretty adverse conditions as well. So that's where I get my joy, actually having somebody turn up in a beaten up old ute and showing me a gore-covered knife, because it just gives me the fizz. But other people like to seek perfection, and that's fine. That's really great. It's because essentially it's where you find your passion in the craft, and I'm all about people finding their passion in the craft, because without passion, it's not an art form, really. So the main argument here is that don't overlook the practical aspects of this craft in order to push what you find enjoyable in the craft onto others at the expense of them focusing their attention where it needs to be in an objective sense. Because, and I do mean that objectively, especially when a knife is designed to be used, it's subjective to have opinions on various aspects of it, but certain parts of a knife are objective fact, that they have to have certain things, like they have to retain an edge, and they have to do it well in order to be a good knife. That's an objective fact. It's not subjective, because otherwise it's not a knife. So Does a knife have to have perfect, smooth grain structure where you can't see the grain with the naked eye? It doesn't. It really doesn't. Should you try and attain that? Absolutely. Always strive to improve your work, make it better. But the thing that you need to focus on the most, the elephant that you should be looking at its entirety, is can the knife do the job? And can it do it well and exceed any expectations that could be put onto it in a realistic scenario? For the ForgeCast to have been brought up, and my responsibility as a co-host of the ForgeCast to be brought up, it did irk me quite a bit, I have to admit. Between Sam and I, we both do very similar things, but we do them in very different ways. Sam is the textbook guy, you know, he's the knowledge, he's the guy that's probably tried everything a few times, and he knows the practical truths of things, but he also knows the textbook, the way, the clean way, the pure way, the ABS way, you know, to achieve perfection. And he's striving to do that, and I have huge respect for Big Fudge to be on that path, to challenge himself to that level. Like it's something that I can't do. It's not in me to do it, and because of that, I have huge respect for Sam and what he does. I am on the other end of the spectrum. I do quite a bit of the same work from Sam, but I've got more of a street view, you know, the layperson view of the way things are done. I don't feel any desire to get too deep into the metallurgy. I want to know the practical aspects of, does it work? Does it do the job? And you'll find that most of the customers that are buying your product think more like me and less like the other end of the spectrum. They just want to know, does it do the job? And there are very good, solid tests you can do to prove that something is fit for task. You don't need to know all of the additional science. It's good to, and you should take the time to if it is within your reach, but especially for beginners, a lot of them hear terms like martensite and pearlite and crystalline structures, and they tune out. They think, this is beyond me, I can't handle this. But I'm here to tell you that don't focus on it. If you're finding it baffling, focus on getting good techniques so that you can keep forging without hurting yourself. Focus on learning the why of design, and then focus on the testing that you need to do and learn from the testing. Every failure, learn from it to work out what you need to do to make better and better products, and always strive to improve that work to the best of your ability without compromising your enjoyment of the craft or the customer's end result. I work with a lot of scrap steel. It's unknown. I don't know what it is, and that's why testing is important. Really, the main argument of this video is, while it is noble, it is great in terms of perfectionism to seek the far end of the scale, to seek ideal hardness. And while it is very achievable if you have things like heat treatment kilns, temperature measuring equipment, a range of good quenchants, etc., to use for more advanced heat treatment, doing your heat treatment and getting a good grain structure is all irrelevant when it comes down to testing. Test your work thoroughly before you send it out. And in a practical sense, you'll realize that the grain structure inside doesn't matter as much as a lot of people will make it out to be. If you have done your heat treatment well enough for task, you will be able to baton into a mild steel bar before you put the edge on. You'll be able to scrape shavings off. And once you put an edge on, you'll be able to see that nice deflection and snapback in your brass rod test. Now, does this mean that these knives are as good as they can be? Oh, no, it really isn't. Some of the super steels that are available, or even some of the normal carbon steels that have been heat treated to perfection, can do incredible things, such as be batoned through a nail with an edge on it, with an actual sharp edge. You can baton it through a nail, still shave with it. That's incredible. Very few customers are going to do that. If you're making knives that are designed to be used in the field, like butchering knives, like chef knives, like general workplace knives, then you don't need them to be able to baton through a nail. You need them to be able to stand up to the rigors of what they're doing. And the testing that we went through here is a really good indicator of that. So focus less on whether or not you're achieving perfection. This is for shooting for beginners here, like myself. Focus less on trying to attain perfection and focus more on trying to attain practicality, aggressive practicality. You need to test your knives harder than they will be ever used in a realistic sense by the end user. If they are buying a knife off you in order to hammer through nails, then you should actually be focusing on getting an edge retention that will exceed that requirement. But otherwise, focus on the practicality of the end result. So hopefully this clarifies what I was saying. Seeing my grain structure was a boon for me because I know what unhardened steel looks like in grain structure, and seeing that it had shrunk down to a zone where it is able to perform to the tasks that to the level that my knives are needed to perform for what they're being made for. That is what I was happy with. So it's not often you get to see inside your knives, but if one snaps, give it a look and see what you're achieving. Hopefully this has been enlightening to you. I know it's a controversial topic, and I have a tendency to approach controversial topics like this, but hey, this is what I do. It was mentioned that, or insinuated I should say, that being a co-host of the ForgeCast, it's irresponsible for me to be putting out information like this. But like I said, I rail against any sort of elitism in any industry, and unfortunately this knife making is no exception to that. Sometimes you're going to get people that say, no, it must be perfect or else nothing is allowed, and unfortunately that's wrong. It's incorrect. Practicality trumps all when it comes down to it. And if you have not heat treated your knife correctly, it will not go through those tasks. As simple as that. And you should be testing all of your knives against those various tests before you ship them out. That's just being responsible. So test your knives properly. You don't always get to see inside. The only way you're going to know if you've done it right is to test it. So test them properly, test them hard, really test them hard. And you'll know for sure whether or not your knife is up to the task that you've designed it for. Otherwise, I will see you all on the next video. I hope you have a good one. Keep making.